From Washington, D.C., the swamp itself, this is the week's worst with Allen and Vadum. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen, Vice President and Chief Investigative Officer of the Capitol Research Center.
And I'm Matthew Vadum, Senior Vice President of the Capitol Research Center.
We're investigative reporters. We go after the crony capitalists, the corrupt special interests, and all the bad guys in politics and public policy in Washington, D.C. and around the country and around the world. This is our podcast in which we dig through the news for stories that we think are the most outrageous, the most ridiculous, the worst. We do it so you don't have to. Well, there's nothing like an election to bring out the sore losers. And did they ever come out? Matthew, tell us a little bit about the rioters. Who's behind them?
The rioters, and who is behind them? Let's see. That would have to be George Soros, in large measure. George Soros is basically the radical currency manipulator who brought down the Bank of England some years back and wiped out, 40% or so of a lot of people's bank savings overnight. George Soros is funding these groups, like Move On, for example, and Black Lives Matter, both of which are very active in the violent, bloody protests that followed more or less immediately after the TV networks called the election for President-elect Donald Trump.
And violence is sort of one of their signature moves because they, of course, were also promoting violence at Trump rallies. They were infiltrating the Trump rallies.
No, those are non-violent protesters.
Oh, I see.
You don't
I'm
understand.
Sorry. Yes, I completely...
No, non-violent. Mostly, those were mostly peaceful events.
Right, mostly peaceful, meaning violent.
Right, so if you're there for an hour and then some 59 minutes go by and then someone hits you with a club, that hour was mostly peaceful. So just remember that.
So we have this fellow, Robert Kramer, who was, or Creamer, I think it's spelled. I don't know which way it's pronounced. But he was the one who visited the White House, was it 342 times?
It was 340-something times. And he even visited the president's residence, which I am told by senior people who've worked in previous White Houses is quite an honor. Not people can work there for years, for a decade, and never even get to see the inside of the president's residence, his quarters at his family's quarters at the White House.
And so we have the tapes from Project Veritas where they went undercover and they actually caught this guy talking about putting people, provocateurs, into the Trump rallies in order to start fights, cause problems.
Right. Those were wonderful undercover videos shot by James O'Keefe's group. He's the Acorn Slayer. And they discovered that Robert Creamer, who was instrumental in getting the Obamacare legislation passed through Congress, in that sense he's described as one of the architects of Obamacare, he said on undercover video that he and his buddy Scott Fovel, an activist from Iowa, they put together protests. They got people to go in to Trump rallies and foment violence. Now, I hate playing the Hitler card, but this is exactly what Hitler's SA did in the early 1930s. Ernst Röhm, who Hitler later had murdered, they'd send in thugs to break up opposition rallies, Socialist Party meetings, communists, any other group that wasn't on their side. They would go in and beat these people up, and these Democrats did the same thing. And what was really, really interesting is that in one of the tapes, Robert Creamer, who is married to Socialist Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, Democrat, Illinois, he said Hillary Clinton knows about all of this through the chain of command, and she's fine with it all. And that's really shocking. And I have to wonder if the Trump administration is going to conduct a racketeering investigation of the Democratic National Committee, because that's not something we're used to in America. Actual conspiring against political campaigns to go in and beat up their supporters. I know, like, labor unions have done that sort of thing to their enemies for a long time, but this is fairly new in the American experience to do this in a presidential election campaign. I've never heard of such a thing.
And of course, we know that there was, for example, the Trump rally that had to be canceled in Chicago.
At the University of Illinois at Chicago, because the activists, the protests there, were too rowdy, and so what the Trump campaign said at the time is they were canceling it out of concern for attendees' safety. And that, in retrospect, was probably a very good move, since we know that a lot of the rabble-rousers were there being paid, apparently by the Democratic National Committee and the Hillary campaign, to stir up SHIT.
And of course, I believe it was Arizona, where they were jumping up on cars and blocking traffic during when there was a Trump rally scheduled. And this is an old technique, I guess, taken to a next step. But if it goes, some of this goes back to Saul Alinsky, who was the person who was a mentor to Hillary Clinton herself personally. She was also a friend of his. And then, of course, Barack Obama was a community organizer trained by the people who had been trained by Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky was the father of this community organizer movement, which is basically professional protesters.
Right, and he wrote two famous, or should I say infamous books, influential books that have had a lasting impact on the left. And that around World War II, he wrote something called Reveille for Radicals. And then in the early 70s, just before he died, he wrote the more seminal work, Rules for Radicals, that explains his organizing and agitating philosophy.
Right, and the one of the things that he's famous for is sending people dressed in Ku Klux Klan outfits to a speech by George H.W. Bush when he was, I believe, UN ambassador, in order to make it look like the Klan was supporting George H.W. Bush, one of the most mild-mannered people, I guess, in the history of American politics.
The man who resigned his lifetime NRA membership because the head of the NRA said made one mean comment about federal law enforcement officials, called them jackbooted thugs after, I think it was Ruby Ridge or the Waco rally. The Waco raid in Texas with the Branch Davidians. That was enough to make him resign because somebody said something unkind about federal police.
So smear technique, this is something that's part of their DNA. And of course, we now have a situation with anyone who is mentioned as a possible appointee in the Trump administration, just as Trump himself was smeared many times. They're going after them. Steve Bannon, of course, is someone who is on that list.
Right, and he has been tagged as an anti-Semite because somebody opened up his divorce files and found that the wife had complained that he allegedly said he didn't want to send his kids to a school that was populated with Jewish students. Now, I don't know if it's true or not, but even if it is true, it's not necessarily racist or anti-Semitic. Maybe he appears to be a worshiping Catholic, devout to an extent a devout Catholic, and perhaps he just wanted to send his kids he wanted them to be surrounded by other Catholics. This is, they have Catholic schools.
Well, that's even
for that. So we don't know if it's true, and even if it is true, it's a big nothing burger. Right. And that is one of the very thin reeds upon which hangs this smear that Steve Bannon is an anti-Semite.
Right, and
I know Steve Bannon, and he's never said anything even remotely off color like that to me the whole time I've known him.
Right, and of course, speaking as a lawyer, anyone who believes the accusations that are made in divorce papers is an idiot, and yet those are brought forward, and we've seen this happen in other cases.
Right, because couples will say the nastiest things about each other, especially when big money and custody of children are concerned.
Right. And then, of course, we have Jeff Sessions, who's the senator from Alabama, who I've known for more than 30 years. And
was that a humble brag?
Well, I actually worked for the senator who was at one point pushing him for a federal judgeship. And the Washington Post went after him, and they presented these ridiculous accusations, some of which were kind of comical. One was that somebody had heard him making the joke that he was fine with the Klan until he found out that they smoked marijuana, which in any case would have been a joke, and yet that was presented as proof that he was a racist.
It's actually kind of funny in a Bob Hope kind of way.
Yeah, and then at one point he went after people who were stealing votes. He caught them red-handed. Now they were acquitted. They had a jury that would not have convicted them under any circumstances. Nevertheless, this was presented as the fact that he was a racist. And the funniest part of the entire attack was the Washington Post, which ran an editorial denouncing him and saying he shouldn't get this federal judgeship. And the headline in the Washington Post was Jefferson Beauregard Sessions. And for years I've told this story about the hypocrisy of...
And that was his full legal name.
That was his full legal name. But that was the now he doesn't go by that. He goes by Jeff Sessions. But that was the headline on the story for a very good reason, because it makes him sound like, oh, he must be a racist. How could you have the name Jefferson Beauregard Sessions and not be a racist? And that's the point they were trying to get across.
Sounds like a major plantation owner and a driver of slaves.
Exactly.
With a name like that.
And I've
so stereotypically Old South.
And I've used that story for years as an example of how people on that side of the fence are hypocrites, because of course as soon as someone mentioned Barack Obama's middle name, which is Hussein, they immediately pointed to that as anyone who did that as a racist.
That was the Republican. That was John McCain who did that.
Right. So yeah, John McCain called on, denounced people who, there was a fellow who introduced him at a rally who had said Barack Hussein Obama, and John McCain called him out on it.
How dare you say his middle name? His
middle name. And so yet they were calling him Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, and it's so funny, by an incredible coincidence, I happen to be looking today at the Huffington Post, and guess how they've started referring to Senator Jeff Sessions? You'll never guess in a million years.
Jefferson Beauregard Sessions?
Jefferson Beauregard Sessions. Once again, he's Jefferson Beauregard Sessions. So this is what we have to deal with in Washington, D.C.
He sounds like a character in like some trashy novel, actually.
Well, this was all part of the reaction, the crazy reaction that we got to the election of Donald Trump. I'm going to pull out a piece of paper here, which I have. I was watching Stephen Colbert's Election Night special, and this is a program. His regular show on CBS wasn't on that night because of election coverage. This was on election night, and so he did his show on Showtime, which is owned by CBS, and it was a little more blue, a little more bad language than you would normally have on a network TV show. But the reactions on that were just so indicative of how people in the establishment media feel about the way that the American people voted in the election. Colbert is asking Mark Halperin and John Heilemann, who are the two political writers most famous for writing the book Game Change, and they have a show on Bloomberg called With All Due Respect. And he had them on as his guests, and again, this is live on election night. And they're finding out as time goes by on the program. They're finding out how the election's going, and they're getting more and more depressed. So at one point, Halperin says that Trump is now on the doorstep of 270 electoral votes, and Colbert says, "Wow, that's a horrifying prospect. I can't put a happy face on that, and that's my job." Of course, he being a comedian. He said, "Is there a comparable moment in American political history? Or are we on virgin snow?" he says. And Heilemann says, "Well, we're not on virgin snow. I wouldn't necessarily say snow. It's like something a little browner." And then Halperin says, "Outside of the Civil War, World War II, and including 9/11, this may be the most cataclysmic event the country has ever seen." And then later, one of the guests on the show is a comedian. She says, "I feel as if I'm about to give birth to a baby that's already dead." So this is the kind of reaction we got from the left and from the people who were upset about it.
They're thoughtful people, aren't they?
Yeah, I know. They really think things through. One of the things that's come up recently has been in this last week is whether Hillary Clinton should be pardoned for her crimes against the country. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it'd be a great idea in one sense, in that it would constitute a de facto admission that she's guilty, and it would blacken her reputation for all time. So in that sense, it would be good. Although it would be nice to see her in front of at the prisoners bar and in a supermax facility where she belongs. It's hard to imagine a Clinton receiving actual justice in America. It's just it's too wild a thought. I can't even picture it happening. So at least a pardon would put an end to the discussions about it. But hey, if they want to try her, hang her upside down by a meat hook at an Esso station, outside Milan, Italy, I'm fine with that.
That's a historical reference for anyone listening, and not to be intended as
to Il Duce. Anyway,
yeah. So the Hillary Clinton. One of the things I'm concerned about is, though, that there are people who might accept the idea of pardoning Hillary in order to get this off our plate, to keep it from being distracting. And of course, you're really talking about equal justice under law. I remember all those people who got upset when Donald Trump said, I'd put you in jail if I could. Well, the question is, should you have the same rule of law for someone who's Secretary of State, who's running for president, as you have for that fellow on the submarine who, in order to study his book, he was taking pictures on his phone of some of the classified materials.
And you've noticed, Dr. Allen, the way that the media has framed this issue. They've framed it as a possibility of President Trump exacting revenge against a political enemy. Well, okay, that's one way of looking at it. The other way is that it would be prosecuting an outrageous crime that was committed by a major government official. Do we have to just, we have one standard for Hillary Clinton and another for that unfortunate submariner who took photos of his workplace, basically, right. And I guess it wasn't aware of the gravity of what he had done. Definitely not a spy, and nothing really came of it. And yet he's doing time, and Hillary's getting pretty drunk, apparently, at Chappaqua, New York, her home. If her appearance the other day on TV's indication, she looked really, really awful, which caused a little thrill of Schadenfreude to run up my leg. However, most of us are not. I'm sure you don't have a black heart as I do. You're a nice guy, aren't you, Steve?
I know people in the intelligence community, and they're all disgusted by the fact that Hillary Clinton, in order to further a scheme of pay for play, which is what she was doing, she at the State Department, according to AP, they went through 2 years of records with all the records they could get, and they found that 55% of the time, the people who she met with who weren't part of the government, in other words, the private sector people she met with, 55% of the time, they were donors to the Clinton Foundation. And I'm not talking about, somebody who sees an ad on TV and sends in, 50 cents a month or something like that. I'm talking about $1.5 million on average for these donors to the Clinton Foundation. So
right, and Huma Abedin, who has ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, her top assistant, vice chairwoman of her campaign, was the gatekeeper for that. And she would be arranging, she'd be like coy when somebody wanted to set up an interview. As we discovered from WikiLeaks and testimony and so on, that she would shake them down. She would, put them on hold and then come back to them and then shake them down for money for the Clinton Foundation in order to set up access to Hillary Clinton herself.
Right, and in order to cover that up, and who knows what else, I mean, we know some things, Chelsea having her wedding paid for, at least in part by the Clinton Foundation, the fact that Hillary was sending classified documents to her maid, who didn't have a security clearance for these things,
so
print
that the
these
maid
documents
could print
out.
Them out.
So the maid could print them out, which is a terrible threat, risk for our national security. But mainly taking 66,000 government documents, 66,000 government documents, any one of which for her to take would be a felony, and she steals them. I mean, this is the equivalent for those who, get confused by the electronic world, the digital world that we live in. Just think of this. If she were Secretary of State and she had a truck pull up to her office and they took 66,000 documents from her files and put them in the truck and took them and put them in her basement and didn't lock the door of her basement so that it was available. There's a 99% estimate by the intelligence community that the things that were on her server, these 66,000 documents, were hacked by our country's adversaries. And she does this without any regard to the national security, without any regard. I mean, there were things in there where the slightest little bit of information might lead to, say, the exposure of one of our intelligence agents who could be then executed. Now, we'll never know, or we might know years from now, the complete implications of what she did. But we know she stole 66,000 documents. And it infuriated me this last year that this would be referred to without using the word steal or stole or stolen, because that's what she was doing. And the idea that she would get away with that is just so much a violation of what this country stands for that I have a hard time accepting the idea of a pardon for Hillary Clinton, and would really.
I'm not saying I support it. I'm just saying politically, it would. The history books would be very unkind to her if she took a pardon.
Yeah, the only way that I would,
which I would like that
right,
that they're unkind to her.
And of course, they're being the Clintons, they would always claim they were innocent even if they took the pardon.
Well, because the Clintons have magical powers, and it's very difficult to do anything to them. People have been trying for like 30 years of corruption, all the way back to Whitewater and the commodities, the cattle futures deal. Been trying to nail them for criminal or potentially criminal behavior, and they've always failed.
Yeah.
Not because the Clintons weren't guilty, but because they've run out of steam, or they didn't have all the evidence that they needed, or it just was not politically sexy anymore to go after the Clintons.
Right, and I would encourage our listeners to go to our website and see the article that I wrote about the commodities deal, the cattle futures deal, and how much of what the Clintons have done over the years that's corrupt really traces back to that. So one of the things that gets me about the reaction to the election is that everyone talks about what a great upset it was, and how nobody saw this coming. Well, of course, that was the media, and the media's bias, as reflected in the wishful thinking behind their predictions that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and she was going to win easily, and that all the Trump people should just stay home because voting
even
doesn't
on election
matter.
night on Fox. I think around 6:30, Charles Krauthammer, the great conservative intellectual, said Hillary's got it. Hillary's going to win.
Yeah. And they, of course, after the election is over, then they came up with all sorts of wild explanations, because having predicted that this could never happen, they now have to explain what did happen. So you have the Comey explanation. And of course, Trump was gaining on Hillary the whole time leading up to Comey's initial announcement that he was looking into the emails on the computer that Huma Abedin shared with the infamous Anthony Weiner,
her pedophile ex-congressman husband.
Right, and so that's one of the explanations. Cokie Roberts was on ABC. She said it was just sexism. That's why people voted the way they did. And the former campaign communications director, Jess McIntosh, said that it was internalized misogyny.
Yeah, that's a funny one.
Yeah, that's women hating themselves.
I guess it's probably racism too, although both the candidates were white, really white.
Right, right. Well,
but somehow there's got to be racism in there somehow.
Well, remember those? What was it? A third of the counties that voted twice for Barack Obama switched and voted for Trump this time. So all those counties that voted twice for Barack Obama, but then voted for Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton, they were all racists.
Racist, sexist.
Who voted for Barack Obama. So. And
Islamophobes. Don't forget that.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah. They're all deplorables, don't you know?
They're deplorable people. I thought Van Jones' reaction was really, really funny.
Yes.
I've had some nasty Twitter battles with him. Eventually, Van Jones, his Twitter handle, it's burnt into my memory, Van Jones 68, because he was born in 1968. Nasty, nasty fights with him. Finally, he blocked me. I wondered what it would take. Anyway, he had the really over-the-top reaction to the election. You know, he asked on CNN, where he's the resident Bolshevik, how do I explain this to my children? And then he said that this is a nightmare for the country, a nightmare for minorities. a nightmare for gays, a nightmare for all the people who are part of the Democratic coalition. So that was really, really crazy. And then the discussions, not just Van Jones, the other left wingers saying, well, how do I explain this to my children? Since, Donald Trump is basically Hitler and now he's going to be our president. So they're agonizing over it. Then Lena Dunham, Lena Dunham, who should never, ever be naked in any of her productions. Because it's frightening.
Well, she certainly is an advertisement for not having tattoos.
Right.
I would say that.
Yeah. She's, I don't know if she's a no talent, but I don't like her work. Or her nude body for that matter. But her over-the-top reaction as she retreated to Arizona to confer with nature and the rocks and something like that. It was a really crazy explanation that I read. But, that's what these uneducated, dumb Hollywood types do. Keith Olbermann is Trump is, this is the Third Reich all over again, and we must oppose him right now. So, I thought Keith Olbermann had died or something because he hadn't been in the news for so long. But apparently he's still out there, and GQ magazine hired him. Not sure why they hired him exactly, but GQ.
And Cher promised to move to Jupiter.
Cher promised to move to Jupiter, and I always like to point out Cher's real name is Sherilyn Sarkisian, so you can see why she shortened it.
So the Democrats, where do they go from here? They have the new spokesman for the Democratic Party appear to be Bernie Sanders, who supported Hillary Clinton despite the fact that he hit right on everything about her that was crooked, and her support for the Wall Street bailout as well, and her support for the war in Iraq, and all these things that people on the left don't like. But boy, he had no problem endorsing her in the fall.
That's right. What about the new likely DNC chairman? Right from where we sit right now. It looks like Congressman Keith Ellison, Democrat, Minnesota, an actual protege of Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan. Keith Ellison, ties to jihadists and Islamic terrorists up the wazoo. He has a very good shot at becoming the leader of the Democratic Party. And a lot of people have already come out in support of him. One of them being Bernie Sanders, another being Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid. This is quite a radical turn, even for the Democrats, to put a jihadist, a likely traitor, as chairman of their party. It would definitely change the dynamic in national politics.
And
if it happens.
So Ellison, you called himself Keith X Ellison, I believe, and
right.
and was a protege of, as you say, of the Nation of Islam founder, who's an anti-Semite and just a overall anti-American.
And then the left is saying that Steve Bannon, because he allegedly didn't want his kids to go to a school that was mostly Jewish, therefore he's the same as a Nazi.
Right.
When you have actual, real life, modern day Nazis in the place of in the form of these Islamists like Congressman Keith Ellison and Congressman Andre Carson, who I imagine, how could he not support his buddy for the DNC chairmanship?
And, of course, one of the people supporting him is another future leader of the party, Elizabeth Warren, who got rich and famous by claiming to be an American Indian, which she is not, and hence the term Pocahontas that people sometimes use to describe her. And sometimes this is presented in the media as insulting her Indian heritage. That would be the Indian heritage she doesn't actually have, and how she...
Well, everybody knows that American Indians have high cheekbones, as
that's
we learned
right.
from the Elizabeth Warren.
That was her excuse, was
saga.
that she looked in the mirror.
Which would probably be news to the people of the Czech Republic and my distant relatives in Scandinavia.
Hey, I'm more American Indian than Elizabeth Warren is, and I never put that down for affirmative action purposes.
And your nickname isn't Lies a Lot, is it?
That's right. So this is the Democratic Party is in disarray, and I guess we're going to find out in the months to come what direction they take and whether they go completely off the deep end as a result of this election. Well, that's our show for this week, and we'll be off next week for Thanksgiving. Yes, we did do one show and then took a week off. But
But we'll be back after Thanksgiving.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing you do in Washington, D.C. You do one show and take a week off. We'll be back on...
well, it's not like anybody works in the city, so why should we be any different?
Right. We'll be back on December 2nd and weekly after that. We hope you'll join us. Please follow us at the Capital Research Center on Facebook, on our YouTube channel, and at Capital Research on Twitter. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen.
And I'm Matthew Vadum at Capital Research Center. I wanted to just also add we've got a new blog called bombthrowers.com, and I encourage you to visit it because we throw a lot of bombs there.
And thanks for listening.